now. That way we will be able to have it available for everyone after the training. But again, I wanted to go ahead and just take this opportunity to thank everybody that took the time to join us today. It has been a while since we've had an opportunity to get together and and have this type of a training session. So I'm excited about some of the items that we are going to be able to bring up today. I look forward, as always, to to the communication and the conversations on the items that we're going to be having. And so with that said, let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that I wanted to discuss today is kind of some housekeeping items, typical for what we're doing now in this virtual world that we live in. And then, of course, go over some of the items that we'll be talking about today. So one of the things that I will ask, and I think that everybody here is very familiar with these virtual meetings now, because that is just what we do. I ask that you all keep yourself muted during the presentation. Also, there is a raise hand function. If you do have questions as we're going through the slides, go ahead and raise your hand. I did build in some stopping points where I will go back and call on those individuals that have raised their hand. And then also, if you do have a comment or a question, you can type those in the chat, as I was just told, if you have that option available. Because I think that there are a couple of people who potentially may not have the chat option. But if you do, go ahead and enter them in chat. If you don't, by all means, raise your hand. You can use either of those two. We do have closed captions running on this particular training today. So the availability for closed captioning can be found on the 3 dots, which is the More Actions icon on your screen. And you can actually turn on live captions on that area, and that'll give you the opportunity to go ahead and see the captioning. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, this training is being recorded. We will be recording this training in order to allow us the opportunity to post it on our website. And for those individuals that may not have had an opportunity to join us today, they'll have the option of going in there and reviewing this training as well. So there are a lot of things that we will be talking about today. This morning's session will be covering the facility condition assessment. We'll be covering Senate Bill 536 funding. And then, of course, we will be talking about the 2019 Capital Outlay Process Review Report. So those are some of the things that we're going to be covering in this morning's session. One of the things that that I found with this particular software that we're using, we typically use GoToMeeting, now we're using Teams, is I don't have a pinch option. So if you're not wearing green, I guess you guys are in good shape. So that was my one St. Patrick's Day discussion point for today. I hope everybody is doing well. Now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Acting Secretary Stephanie Rodriguez for some opening comments and remarks.
Hi there. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you all for being here today. I have to say the turnout of this virtual session has been amazing, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about capital outlay and the processes that we're implementing here at the agency. Now, aside from Gerald, I have to say you're in good company, and I'll tell you why. I'm actually an architect and planner by trade, although I work in the higher education sphere. And so with that being said, I know that there's a lot more that goes into planning and implementing a plan so that we can have a facility at our higher education institutions. A lot of people think it's a piece of paper with a signature line by the president and call it a day. But what Gerald and I have been teaching individuals is it's much more than that. And for that, I really appreciate all that you do, and also your willingness to come to the table and participate in this process, since we have to report this to the legislature. You guys are also very innovative. You look at sustainability, you look at function, you look at how facilities interact with their environments. And typically it's outside of our students, but it also can be at the service of our communities at large. So that's my little enlightening spiel to you all, but I also want to tell you some of the good stuff that's happening for capital outlay. So as you know, FY21 GEO bond funds are expected to be sold at the end of the month. They will provide $155 million of funding to higher education institutions across the state. Additionally, HB 285 is working its way through the legislative session, and it will provide additional capital funding to colleges and universities as well. The GEO bond and HB 285 projects will infuse a large amount of money into the economy of New Mexico. This is an example of how important capital outlay is, that it provides to not only the economic stimulus to our states, but also through the hiring of individuals and the projects itself. It provides GRT revenues for local economies and businesses, and the benefit of providing safe, state-of-the-art facilities for our students outweighs everything. The agency has the responsibility of recommending capital outlay funding of our colleges and universities each year. I know you all are very familiar with the process. The session will give you insight on the work that has been done in the Capital Projects Division to improve upon our process. And like Gerald said, this is an opportunity for you to not only learn the process, but engage in the process and ask questions on how we can improve this process moving forward, while still ensuring that we provide the right information to our legislature so that they feel comfortable providing us with this funding now and in the future. So with that, Gerald, thank you so much for having me today. I do have to leave. I was looking forward to being here all day, but I just was notified 2 days ago that the governor wants to confirm me as the cabinet secretary. So I'm going to jump over to Senate rules and start preparing for that. But thank you for being here. And I look forward to hearing the conversation that you have today.
Thank you, Secretary. I appreciate your time. So as the Secretary was mentioning, there are a lot of things that, that the Higher Education Department and the higher education institutions coordinate with. And of course, for this division and for my relationship with all of the institutions, it has to do with capital. And we understand how important capital is to the higher education institutions. And one of the things that we wanted to accomplish today is discussing what specifically it is that we need to do at the agency in order to better support those recommendations to the legislature. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the presentation, talk a little bit about what we're going to, what we did work on, and of course, provide an opportunity for you all to to provide some feedback and ask some questions. So the first section that I want to go over is the facility condition assessment. So what is a facility condition assessment and why is it important? Well, a facility condition assessment is really an analysis of the condition of a facility in terms of age, design, construction methods, and materials. It could be compared to an inventory, a list of what the facility has and what it needs in order to function on a daily basis. And of course, facility condition assessments are important because they determine the extent to which a facility is able to meet the intended purpose. But why am I bringing this up? And why am I talking about a facility condition assessment? Well, the reason for that is because during the 2018 legislative session, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this in multiple iterations throughout previous legislative sessions, There was a House Memorial 113 that was introduced that requested that the Higher Education Department conduct a facilities assessment and capital planning process study of higher education facilities. You know, I've bulleted some of the items that were in that House Memorial of what the legislature was requesting that we do. They mentioned a needs assessment of each facility, that it could lead to a capital planning process that would include a complete project list tied to the institutional mission and financial capacity of the institution. It also asked for a systematic approach and prioritization of structures that could result in improved efficiency and effectiveness. And then the last thing that the House Memorial mentioned was the goal of the study, which is to determine the current and future maintenance cost savings and to reduce current cost savings from misuse or excess use of materials or funds. Well, this House Memorial did not have any funding associated with it, but we did look at the items that it did request from us in order to see what type of changes we could potentially make or what areas we potentially could grow on based on these recommendations in the House Memorial. So what we did is we looked at that information, and then lo and behold, in 2019, during the 2019 legislative session, we received $232,000. I mean, $232,000. And this funding that was obtained was for a facility needs assessment and institutional analysis. And really, what that language stated was, it was for us to organize and execute a statewide plan that uses state optimization and other best practices to develop a comprehensive and uniform method for capital funding and planning. So when the NMHED received this funding, we had to make a decision on how we were going to best utilize it. You know, we received a few recommendations, as you can imagine, on how to use the money. One of them was do a facility assessment on 2 or 3 schools as a pilot project, and then build from there. Or look at a process like Public Schools Finance Authority and PSCOC, and use the funding to develop a process similar to what they have in place. And then, of course, we received many questions from legislators about how we anticipated spending this funding and what would be our next steps in getting it done. So let's talk a little bit about some of the decisions that we had to make. And of course, as you know, when the legislature is requesting this information from us, there's no pressure on us, right? Well, so what we did was, you know, we looked back on what was done in the past. So we know that in 2006, there was a facility condition assessment. That assessment was a collaboration with HEIs and the Higher Education Department that commissioned a general facility condition of 100% of all BR&R funded space in the state. That amounted to 17.3 million gross square feet of space. For those of you that were around at that time, you remember that 3DI Parsons are the ones that conducted the assessment. And in that assessment, as a whole, higher education facilities were scored with an FCI of 35.13%. You know, this assessment provided current facility condition data, cost budgets, prioritized current deficiencies, and forecasted future deficiencies. There was also a software application that was developed along with this assessment that was called Comet. And it was included as part of the assessment in order to house the condition data for use by all the HEIs to track and add to their facility condition information. And that was all based on condition, funding, and resulting improvements. Well, The pros to that was that it did establish a statewide inventory with condition assessment data, and it created a web-based system to update and track facilities. The cons were that it was not sustainable. It needed recurring funding, and it only assessed facility condition. So we knew that that was not something that we felt would work, but we weren't sure. The next thing we looked at was our form updates. I worked with many of you all at the higher education institutions in order to do updates to the 2018 and 2019 summer hearing forms. We asked for more detailed project descriptions. We wanted to tie the rationale to the mission of the institution, requested a methodology for ranking the projects, if it was an FCI, if it was another type of condition assessment. Those are some of the updates that we made together. And then in 2019, we added the space verification as a supplemental sheet. So, as you know, in House Memorial 113, the legislature also asked us for a facilities assessment. So I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this is that, a facility needs assessment and prioritization process is something that the legislature and LFC have been talking about for quite a while. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to go through and see, what was our current process after we look back at the past, what our current process looked like. So as we compare, we needed to ask ourselves some questions. In our current funding process, what are we asking for? What are we receiving? Does the information make sense? Does the data translate into measurable outcomes? What processes do each of the HEIs in the state use for managing their capital assets and for preparing their funding requests and priorities? What do other states use? What kind of software are available in the process? How do we ensure sustainability? These are some of the questions that we asked ourselves as we were looking at this, to see what it is that we potentially could do. So what we decided was we don't know a lot of these answers, and we really didn't want to make a change without understanding more about what should drive any change, even if we needed any change. So what we did in May of 19 is we sought out a vendor to provide us with the following, and I listed some bullet points on here. We asked for someone who could obtain a facility needs assessment and institutional analysis for each of the HEIs in the state, executing a system plan that uses space optimization and other best practices, develop a comprehensive and uniform method for capital planning, and then based on all of this information gathered, give us some recommendations on what we could potentially do or change or adjust in our process in order to meet the requests that we had been receiving from the legislature. So the Higher Education Department chose GHaubold Consulting to provide us with this information. We thought it would be important for Mr. Haubold to present to us today so he could provide information on the work he did for the Higher Education Department and how that work translated into the capital outlay process review report. As a reminder, the report is available on the NMHED website at the link provided in the meeting invite. So if you would like to follow along, if you go to our website, or if you go to the link in the meeting invite that I sent out, you'll find the report in there, and you can follow along as we start up the next section. So I'll go ahead and pause here real quickly to see if anybody has any questions. I don't see any hands raised. I don't see anything in the chat. But if anybody does have anything that they want to bring up or discuss now, I'll go ahead and just give it a minute and go from there. So I don't see any questions coming up. So at this time, what I'd like to do is go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Glen Haubold for his section of this presentation. Glen?
Well, and so thank you for having me, Gerald, and thank you all for joining us today. I do ask for a little patience. I went out of my way to make sure I could get a good connection today, and about this time, some pretty good thunderstorms are popping up around me. So if I get knocked off, I'll be right back. That happened just once while I was listening to the secretary. So I do ask for a little patience. But yes, I really look forward to the opportunity to talk about the work we did. I'd like to start off just with the scope first. We met with, all 32 public post-secretary institutions. I got to visit with all of you. There's many old friends in that group. We went over the facility management systems that are in place, and we were expected to provide a report to NMHED detailing each of the systems and what the schools were doing. And I would really commend HED. One of the things that was reiterated to me several times was we really want to understand what the schools are doing. And I felt like that was really important after all my years in New Mexico. And I had a great appreciation that NMHED was looking at it from the school's perspective. Okay. Then the next part of the scope of work, we were asked to look at other cloud-based software programs. As all of you know, there's just many programs out there, and every one of them is advertised as the latest, greatest, and it's going to pick your projects for you and tell you how to do your job. And so NMHED asked us to look and see what was available, and we did that. And I will share with you, I told Gerald at one point, we were just overwhelmed with people that sent us samples and demos, and it was kind of exciting for me as a consultant. I got to try a whole lot of different software packages and log in as a demo and see how they work. And so in our report, we tried to incorporate some of the results of that. There's just a extensive amount of software out there. Okay. And then we were expected to provide a report, of course. NMHED was interested in what sort of data and information do the institutions house. And again, I think I really want to give credit to NMHED for wanting to take it out of the realm of being anecdotal and see what was out there. They wanted us to look at how the institutions provide and collate the data, and then what kind of software was out there. And what was important about that was there was a feeling that perhaps there were a lot of systems in place, and we didn't want to just suddenly render obsolete any of the efforts that had gone on. And so we were asked specifically to just look and see what sort of systems and planning were in place at the 32 schools. Okay. So then we wrapped all this into a report. We also wanted to look at what other states do, and I think every one of us over the years and maybe with connections through APA and the CUBO, we've heard a lot of things about what other states do, and you can go online and read procedures and look at things. And, there's a certain tendency to think, the grass is greener. We hear about another state where they got a lot of money or another school where they got a lot of money. And so what we wanted to do was to look at what the other states do, how they manage their priorities, what kind of software solutions they have, and what kind of results they get from those, and how does it really work. And then, of course, we had to bundle that up in a report and make it available. Okay. And next slide. And of course, then the final report, and as Gerald said, it is online. I went and reread it again last night to prepare for the meeting today. And the goal was to come up with a sustainable method for housing, prioritizing, and making recommendations to the legislature. And I think that's important to remember, that HED makes the recommendations to the legislature. And I was here in 2006 and couldn't agree more with the comments that it was perhaps, that effort was well intended, but it just wasn't sustainable. And so I was excited to have an opportunity to work with NMHED on something that would be sustainable. Okay. So, as most of you know, I was in New Mexico at the time. I was able to get to 11 institutions personally, which was really exciting to me to get to visit all the schools. I've been in higher ed my whole life, and this was just the fun part of the work. I contacted all 32, talked, met, or traded emails. One of the things that really stood out, the concern with aging infrastructure, was universal. I can say that there was not one person that I talked to that did not express concern of the condition of the facilities and the aging infrastructure. And to couple with that, I was really impressed. The dedication of all the people working in facilities is just phenomenal. And I felt that way before, but I really came away convinced that the dedication of the facilities professionals and the people that are putting these plans together is just so impressive. Okay, next slide. So some of the other things that jumped out, there is a substantial amount of planning that was being accomplished. Everybody may do it a little differently or use different systems, but almost without exception, all of the schools had planning, and that that made me feel good, because a lot of I worked in New Mexico, and sometimes we get the sense that people don't think we're planning. But I came away, as I told the NMHED many times, there is an awful lot of planning going on, which made this study particularly worthwhile in that we didn't want to just get rid of it. We wanted to make sure that we used what we had. Architectural research consultants, just to mention one, they've done a large number of facility master plans throughout the state, quite a few. Many of the schools, particularly at the community colleges, Ad Astra and Dude Solutions were in use. Dude Solutions, everything from doing work orders to energy management, and a large number of schools are using Ad Astra for classroom utilization and schedule optimization, and all those things that NMHED has been looking for. And so that was particularly enlightening. And I was able to go back and report that the schools have been listening to NMHED. The process has been working pretty well as it existed. Okay. So then when we got into looking at the other states, and again, this was, as a longtime facility professional, this was something that was particularly enjoyable for me. It gave me an opportunity to make contact with counterparts in oh gosh, maybe a third of all the states. We got online and looked at procedures. Then we made contact with people that we knew and asked how it really worked. And some things that came up, most of the states that we contacted are trying to come up and demonstrate an objective ranking system for capital outlay, to take it out of the, the let's do a project that looks particularly appealing and come up with ranking projects that meet state goals and objectives. Many of the states also recognize what the people in the trenches recognize, that infrastructure is becoming a real need. And so quite a few states are using their prioritization system to encourage and reward investments in infrastructure. And I'm going to come back to that, but the operative word here is encourage. And then I would add, despite the grass is greener that we sometimes think, New Mexico is one of the few states that has regular capital outlay funding. Now, we may talk to counterparts in other states that, they bring it up every year, or sometimes it's their year, but very few states do it with the regularity that New Mexico does, the every 2-year general obligation bond. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that that's something really to be appreciative of. I came away really grateful for my time in New Mexico, because some of these other states just don't have the benefits of this regular funding that New Mexico gets. Okay. So we had some conclusions, and I'm going to talk about these in some detail in a minute. We recommended that HED software should prioritize projects based on a defined criteria, and we listed facilities condition. Gerald has already talked about how important that is. Utilization, we've all been interested in utilization for a number of years, and program needs. What are the programmatic needs? And we also include in that, that's something that should be able to change as priorities change. Then, I mentioned that we realized that a number of states are doing planning, but not everybody is using the same basis for things like FCI or replacement cost, utilization. If you're going to talk about classroom utilization, of course, for those of you that are into it, the standard week is important. And even when I was at New Mexico State University, not everybody was using the same standard week for Ad Astra. And something else that we realized that while almost everybody had, nearly every school had a master plan, most had current master plans, the level of granularity was pretty wide. And so we thought NMHED should begin to work towards not just asking everybody what to have a master plan, but perhaps to define some of the elements that ought to be in that master plan. And, you know, when we looked at other states, without exception, we felt like NMHED role should be to define the data, but the data is owned by the institutions and they accumulate it and manage it. And this is no different than the institutions do with any of the other data, whether we're talking iPads or the Kubo or even the APA facilities reporting. The institutions should be responsible for the data and given some guidelines and definitions on how to accumulate it. Okay? So, you know, when you get to if you're asked to make a recommendation on something, obviously, the first one always is, well, just keep doing what you're doing. Continue as is. And you know, like I pointed out, what the state of New Mexico is doing isn't working terribly poorly, despite you know, everybody's desire to improve it. We also looked at, because there's been a lot of conversation about it, should the data be managed through a third party? And again, for those of you that were around in 2006, this is exactly what was tried. It's just not sustainable to do it that way. It's been tried before. And then what we recommended was provide guidelines and incentives. It's really widely accepted, almost universally accepted, I should add, that this is how it's done in higher ed, if you will. And it works pretty well. And we've talked to some states where this exact process is working extremely well and coming up with some good outcomes. Okay. So we recommended that NMHED develop and implement a project prioritization process, something that would allow for the goals to be changed or tweaked and incentives provided to get the results that we want. We also, you know, with the universal concern over aging infrastructure, we recommended that New Mexico reinstate and update the build and repair and renewal process. There's currently some freedom for the institutions to use those funds as they see fit. Some of you that have been around a while can remember there used to be some restrictions on how those funds were spent. We recommended that be put back in place, just to remove any temptation to use bill and repair and renewal funds for something other than what the intent was. And then we recommended that NMHED gradually expand their role in terms of, you know, some other states are doing space audits to make sure that it's consistent, to establish some elements and guidance on what goes in a master plan, to give some basis for calculating the facilities condition index. What's the methodology? How are you going to do the denominator, which is the replacement cost? And just in general, provide a little more guidance in how the data gets put together. Okay, next slide, please. As to the project prioritization, you know, the software, let me get something up here. Um, there's standards um, for facility assessments, utilization calculations, and suggested elements. And because of that, we recommended that NMHED select a software vendor to help prioritize the projects separately from the assessments. Instead of a single vendor just to come in and do the whole thing. That was really important because so many of you have accumulated good information and good planning already, and we didn't just want to render that obsolete overnight. We wanted to make sure that we could use what was there, and in many cases to continue to use the vendor that you had been using, just as long as the prescribed process was followed. And that's going to be the subject, I think, of this afternoon's training. Guidance on standard elements. We looked at 16 campuses use SchoolDude for work orders, 14 utilize Adastra for classroom scheduling. There's just a substantial amount of data available. But as you know about space utilization, if you're going to talk about percent capacity, you need to be using the same standard week if you're going to make those comparisons. If you're comparing FCI, you should be using the same methodology for coming up with replacement cost. But back to the overall space utilization and classroom efficiency, we felt like that 2/3 of the institutions, or well over half, had comparable data with just a little bit of tweaking, and it was important to try to reuse that. And then, back to the facilities condition, some people pointed out that they had facilities condition on some buildings. Some had facilities condition on some systems. Some had complete inventories. And again, we wanted to make sure that everybody could reuse the existing data and vendors that they had, but we wanted to get it into a process that allowed it to be scored and ranked as part of this project prioritization. And that is something that the institutions do all of the time. We are given definitions, and our institutional research, or the different groups put the information together. And again, for the facilities condition, if we do that, then the assessments start to become comparable. And I would remind everybody that it's, even when we look at the process this afternoon, the condition index is not compared one school to another. It's an internal tool that the schools use to develop your priorities. And what we give points for in the rubric is the fact that you have a process. And that's the most important thing, is that we wanted to provide an incentive for each of the institutions to develop a process. Okay. Next slide, please. And again, throughout the report, we emphasized, what we're trying to do is to align the capital resources that we have with the strategies, priorities, and goals for higher education in New Mexico. And we felt like that this best could be done, through the carrot rather than the stick, if you will, through proper incentives that are objective. And so I guess I'm going to finish a little bit early, but we can certainly take some questions.
So thank you, Glenn. I appreciate the the overview. Um, I wanted to just let everybody know that for this first session, one of the things that we wanted to make sure and accomplish um, is is providing the background and the steps that the agency took in order to prepare for what we will be talking about during the next session, which is the new capital outlay funding request process. Now, I think Glenn touched on several important items that I always had in my mind as we were making these decisions, and that is understanding that what we've done in the past may or may not be the best option moving forward. Understanding the amount of work that you all do at the institution level and recognizing that that data is important and useful, and making sure that we understood, which is why we asked for the report, how that data could be brought, how that data is brought together at the institution level, how it's used, and then how potentially we might be able to incorporate it into any changes that we were to make. So as many of you know, we introduced this process last year, but we didn't have an opportunity to have the training for it because this is really what we at the Higher Education Department wanted to do before rolling it out. But I think it was a good way for institutions to test drive, the new process, test drive the new forms, look and see what the new matrix and prioritization looks like, and then to start to prepare based on that rollout. So that was really that's really what this what this morning's session is about, is giving you all of the pieces, giving you all of the information that built up where we are at. And so with that said, I want to go ahead and take the time now to answer any questions that anyone may have. As I mentioned before, you can enter those questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand icon, and of course I'll call out on you. And then what we'll do is after the questions, what we can do is break and come back at 10:30 for the next session. But like I said, let's go ahead and do some questions, and if anybody has any. And of course, Mr. Haubold is here to answer any questions, and of course I'm here as well. So I'll open it up to questions now. So let me look at the chat. So real quick, I do have a question in the chat. If it'll be possible to get the recording of the meeting. The answer is yes. This meeting is being recorded and will be available after the training today. It will be posted to the NMHED website, and the slides will also be posted there as well, along with all of the other materials that we go over. So I hope that answered your question. There was another hand raised, but it is now gone. Let's see if I can find it here. Yes, Marvin.
Good morning.
Good morning, Marvin.
So as we look at this, and we're looking at the data, the consistent data. Like Mr. Haubold said, we need to define what things mean, and how do you propose that we as a state are gonna have that conversation?
So that's actually a really good question, Marvin. And the reality is that you know, that's something that we're actually going to cover in the next section. Because really what Mr. Haubold was going over now is the recommendations. This report was what recommendations and what the report gave the higher education department as far as information. You know, what the next session is going to cover is how we took those recommendations and what we implemented as a result. So that's what that conversation is going to be now, you know, during this next session. This really, like I say, was, I wanted for everybody to have a real clear picture of what it is that we did, you know, as our homework and our preliminary, you know, discussions, and then what data we received through Mr. Haubold's report, and like I say, and then that'll lead us into our next section, where I will actually cover what you're talking about here, Mark.
Thank you.
Luis, you had a question?
Yes, I did. Thank you. When you were doing the presentation, and for some of those, some of us who were here back when they did the old 3DI, I think the idea was to try to see how we could increase the amount of BRR funding to each one of the schools, because it was at that time, and I still believe it's the case today, it is completely underfunded in relation to the amount of money we need. And so I'm wondering, will this process help to build that gap for us in order to get the additional funding that we need, since I know we haven't put enough money into our facility. So I'm just wondering, will that help? I mean, how is all this process going to help get additional BR&R funding?
I appreciate that question. It's a really good question, Luis, and I hate to do the same thing that I did with Marvin's question, but that is actually going to be covered in the next section, because again, the recommendation that we just now went over, you know, is just that, right? It was the recommendation from the report, and so, you know, so what we will be talking about in the next section is BR&R and how we have incorporated BR&R not as a funded item, but as a data point that we need to be able to extract and understand in order to present a picture to the legislature of the importance of BR&R and how well BR&R is already being managed in the limited amount that is already received, and how BR&R is being how BR&R projects are being supplemented by capital because of the lack of BR&R funding. And that's the picture that we want to build, and that's what we'll be talking about a little bit more in the next session. So I hope that kind of helps to bridge that until we get to that point.
Thank you.
Ronnie, I see that you, or there is a question in the chat or a comment, and it says, so many of us have maintained the old 3DI level 1 and 2 reviews. Are they still worth keeping as the information is outdated and really obsolete? So my response to that is the data that you have is important to have at the institution level, but that decision really needs to be made at the that decision needs to be made at the institution level. And you'll see why as we go into the next section, because again, one of the things that we felt was extremely important in the report was the fact that institutions have a lot of data. And so again, I know that wasn't a straightforward answer in regards to that, but as we go into the next section and you start to understand how our new process is going to utilize your data, then institutions can start to decide on which data is most important to keep or to sunset. Glenn, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, would you mind if I just had a couple of comments on that 3DI and the BRR?
Not at all.
So, as to the BRR question, and again, I would point out that it was an eye opener for me, having served the state of New Mexico in the facilities world, and then as a consultant, generally we met with the business officer or the facilities officer, and universal concern was expressed about the BRR, and some expressed concern that it wasn't enough. But as we reported to NMHED, I can tell you that not every school spends all of the allocation on BRR. Some have dipped into it for other uses, which is their prerogative under the way it's administered. But it also makes it challenging to make the case for more BRR when it's not all being spent on BRR. And so I would just sort of, mention that to everybody. And it wasn't because the facilities people weren't spending it on facilities either. I would just kind of suggest that. But if you're going to make the case that you need more BRR, I think it's important that every bit of what you get and from just speaking from a school that did keep it up, not too many schools kept it up. I think everybody still may have it, but not a lot of schools kept it up. And I would just point out that to bring that data up to date, you have to go back and split up all your projects, as to which piece was infrastructure, and then apply it to that data. And so, as Gerald said, that's an institutional decision. But from a data perspective, you might find that it's more work to bring that old data up to date than it is to generate new data. So I would just kind of offer that as a little bit of information. So that's all I had. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you, Glenn. And that is a good point as well. On the current guidelines for BR&R as currently written, and so I will touch a little bit on that because it is not something that I have covered in the next section. But as you know, or as many of you may know, there was a point in time when BR&R was given some additional flexibility to be used, on other needs at an institution other than infrastructure. And and that was done. That was done in a time when when funding was very limited, and a decision was made to free up BR&R to allow institutions to be able to, for lack of a better term, survive, right? And so I know that we have had the conversation over the past couple of legislative sessions. I've had the conversation with CUP as well as the other associations about doing a funding request for BR&R, as a one-time lump sum infusion of money. as well as, trying to figure out ways to make a sustainable BR&R appropriation to institutions each year. And so, I think that one of the things that we know for sure is that, as Glenn mentioned, many institutions are still transferring the percentage of BR&R from their ING that was originally established back when the formula was last in play. As we know, that dollar amount does not account for inflation, and it does not account for the increased needs of deferred maintenance at each campus. But it is the institution's way of continuing to set that money aside. So there are conversations that we are going to have going forward about adjusting the way BR&R is managed. And they're going to be uncomfortable conversations, because for those individuals that are in facilities, we know the need is there to have an increased amount of BR&R being set aside from ING. But for those that are using ING for other purposes on campus, it's gonna be tough knowing that, that there may be a potential that additional money will come out of ING for BR&R that they can't utilize. And so it's a difficult balance, but it is a conversation that we are going to have going forward. Again, when we talk about it in the next session, the approach that we have put in on the higher education department side will hopefully build a better picture to allow us the opportunity to start adjusting BR&R and start looking at ways on how we can make it, make that funding stream available and hopefully sustainable. So again, just wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit as well, on that aspect of it. Is there anybody else that has any questions about this morning's or this first session? So I don't see any questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording, and then stop that there.